It's on.
We've had a little bit of repositioning on stage. So, ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, a very, very warm welcome to the second of today's festival sessions, and what I'm sure will be a very appropriate companion piece for those of you who were here earlier for our session Unsung Heroes. As some of you may know, my name is Alistair Burtonshaw, and I'm the new director here at the Charleston Trust. But before we start, thank you. But before we start, just a quick housekeeping announcement, if I may. Please can you just take a moment to note the locations of the fire exits within the marquee. I'm obliged to tell you this. In the very unlikely event that we need to evacuate, please do follow the instructions of Charleston staff, who will direct you to a safe assembly point. I would also be very grateful before we start if you could just take a moment to check that your mobile phones are off for us. So, I'll get these microphones right. I feel particularly honoured to welcome Victoria and Gillian here to Charleston, as I've had the great pleasure of working with both Victoria and Gillian during their respective tenures as presidents of English Pen, the founding centre of the Worldwide Writers' Fellowship that does such important work for freedom of expression. Victoria Glendinning, CBE, is one of the UK's most renowned biographers. She's also a highly respected critic, broadcaster and novelist, as I've mentioned, a former president and honorary vice president of English Pen, a winner of the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, and a vice president of the Royal Society of Literature. Victoria went up to Oxford to study modern languages before becoming a psychiatric social worker, going on to write numerous highly acclaimed biographies, including the lives of Edith Sitwell, Victoria Sackville-West, Anthony Trollope, Rebecca West, Jonathan Swift, Leonard Woolf, and now her life of the enigmatic Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, founder of both Singapore and the London Zoo. Gillian Slovo is a South African novelist, playwright, and memoirist. The daughter of South African anti-apartheid campaigners Joe Slovo and Ruth First, she has previously said in a Guardian interview that one of the greatest things she learned from her parents was the importance of being connected to the world and of taking responsibility for what happens within it, which I think is truly inspiring. Her novel, Red Dust, a courtroom drama, explored the meanings and effects of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and was made into a film released in 2004, the same year that her novel Ice Road was shortlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction. Set during the siege of Leningrad, it is an ambitious exploration of what constitutes history. Her 1997 memoir, Every Secret Thing, My Family, My Country, is an account of her childhood in South Africa and her relationship with her parents, who lived perilous lives of exile, armed resistance, and occasional imprisonment. She's also an accomplished playwright, compiling Guantanamo, Honour Bound to Defend Freedom with Victoria Britain, and her verbatim play from spoken evidence, The Riots, which premiered in late 2001, following the riots of that summer. As already referenced, Jillian is also the current president of the English Centre of International Pen, the Worldwide Writers' Fellowship. So without further ado, please join me in offering a very warm Charleston welcome to Victoria Glendinning and Gillian Slovo for what will, I am sure, be an utterly fascinating exploration of two honourable men. Thank you.
Is this working and can you hear me? Yes. I'm going first simply chronologically because my man is very early empire and Gillian's man is sort of height of late empire. And between us we seem to cover the waterfront. Some of you may wonder when exactly Stamford Raffles was. His dates are 1781 to 1826. You're thinking the Regency period. Now, everyone has heard of Raffles Hotel in Singapore, which was named for him many, many decades after he died. Raffles founded Singapore. In 1819, he raised the Union Jack on what was then a small tropical island the size of the Isle of Wight, off the tip of the Malaysian peninsula. There were a few poor Malays, a few Chinese living there, and a plague of rats. And beyond the beach, The whole island was solid, undifferentiated jungle. Look at Singapore now, love it or hate it. It's a skyscraper jungle, the most profitable and efficient small state in the whole world, uniquely with a surplus, not a deficit, and it's a world centre for trade, international travel, financial services, education, you name it. And this is not chance. Raffles had, throughout all his career, a vision, an unrealistic vision of an Eastern Empire under benign British influence. He was the most romantic imperialist. He was ahead of his time. But with Singapore, he created this great hub. The British Empire did not last, but Singapore did last. Raffles came from nowhere, or that is, he came from Walworth, which is then a rather dim little village just south of the Elephant and Castle in London, south of the Thames. His father was a sea captain, probably in the slave trade, I can't prove that, with the West Indies. And he went to the bad. I think it was gambling, because Raffles would never in all his life go to a race meeting. And he died, old Raffles, in an almshouse. And Tom Raffles, that's our Tom, was the only boy in a family of sisters. And all his life he was responsible for providing for his family. He was hardly educated at all. He went for 2 years to a small private school. There was no state education, of course, which provided education for clerks, clergymen, maybe the universities, but he never went to university. And at 14, through the influence of a tea merchant uncle, he entered as a clerk at 14 into the East India Company. Now, the East India Company really was the British Empire in those days. No global modern company has such political clout, such logistical power. The company had its own chartered fleet of sailing ships, the East Indiamen, lying along the Pool of London, unloading spices onto wharfs and into warehouses, the ones that are now very, very expensive apartments. And the company had its own army with its own uniforms. It was the largest single employer in Britain and employed literally thousands of civil servants, officials, soldiers, sailors, agents, chaplains, law officers, clerks, an inordinate amount of them Scottish. Sometimes I felt Raffles was the only Englishman in the whole book. And in the it had areas of control: Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and trading posts and points, settlements on the East Indian archipelago, what is modern Indonesia. And the company had the monopoly in Britain of trade with India and was cultivating the much more lucrative China route, because tea only came from China then, and it was becoming much more profitable than pepper and nutmegs. Even the Governor-General of India at this time is a company appointee. Salaries weren't high, but fortunes could be made in private trading in spices from the islands of the archipelago, and silks and porcelain from China, by company personnel who, if they survived shipwreck, cholera, malaria, dysentery, insanity, might come home at age 40 filthy rich or ruined. The company was leaking money. There was a huge trade gap. Imports from the East were much more than the rather feeble exports of the only things that the very conservative company could think to send out. But the East India Company was too big to fail, or thought to be. It lumbered on for 30 years after Raffles' death, though nothing is really too big to fail. Not good enough?
No, it's fine. It's just when you put your head down.
Oh. So the teenage boy, Tom Raffles from Walworth, worked for 10 years in India House, the company's great, big, gloomy premises in Leadenhall Street in the city. And the work was copying. He copied and recopied and recopied letters, drafts, dispatches, reports, all day long and every day in dim warrens of offices, icy in winter and fetid in summer. And clerks like him were human word processors. And down the gloomy corridors, the chairman and the court of directors conferred in their grandiose chambers. And the tottering bureaucracy of India House, with its laborious procedures between the different departments and between India House and the government-appointed Board of Control, was beyond anything described later by Dickens in, say, Bleak House. Letters from the East took up to 8 months or more to arrive by sailing ship, another 8 months for answers to be drafted, passed from department to department, held up by the Board of Control, copied and recopied, another 8 months for the replies to reach the East. And this paralysing slowness, exploited by Raffles when he was out East, made opportunism and personal initiative irresistible and, career-wise, very dangerous. Raffles became much too individualistic and inner-directed to please the company. He took the measures he thought essential at the time, where he was, and asked permission afterwards, and this got him into hot water like all the time. He was small and he was slight and not physically tough. He never fired a gun in his life. What he was hard-working and sociable and charming. He had zeal, which was the great praise word of the period. He had an excessive zeal, they thought, after a little while. He was given opportunity. He was spotted for his cleverness and difference in India House, and he was sent out to Penang in the Malacca Strait as Assistant Secretary when he was 24, and he never looked back. He was spotted again by Lord Minto, the Governor-General of India, and helped mastermind the invasion of Java, taking it from the Dutch. He became Java's Lieutenant Governor at the age of 30. This was almost an overwhelming opportunity. He was a back office man with no serious administrative hinterland, in charge of a country with about the same population as England had then, about 5 million people. So young Lieutenant Governor Raffles was insecure in the job, and the job too was insecure because it was sort of tacitly understood that Java would be given back to the Dutch if the British and her allies won the war with Napoleon, which was looking likely. However, he behaved as if there was no tomorrow. He established a judiciary, abolished forced labour, tried to change the abusive system of land tenure, emancipated slaves. This was one of his lifelong crusades. He also amassed knowledge of Javan history and culture. Like a lot of early colonial servants, he was a passionate naturalist. He sent plants and seeds back to the Royal Society and to Kew Gardens, and brought home specimens of animals, birds and fish never before seen in the West. And his team uncovered from the jungle, a lot of you will have been there, the great Buddhist monument of Borobudur, built onto a hill. 200 labourers worked for 6 weeks, taking earth and volcanic lava away from, and jungle growth away from the carvings. And the great head of the Buddha that Neil MacGregor used for one of his 100 objects, the history of the world in 100 objects, was a head that Raffles had brought back from Borobudur. He also collected musical instruments, shadow puppets, artifacts by the 100. And Southeast Asian zoology and botany and archaeology and world music and ethnology, not that that word was used then, owe a great deal to Raffles. And the good thing about him is that all his postings, it was also the bad thing about him, he put the welfare of the inhabitants before immediate profit. In fact, he was a fairly hopeless and hopelessly optimistic manager, and his activities consistently cost the company money. He took the view that profits would accrue in time with better social conditions, but the company saw only the bottom line, and in any case he didn't have the time. He was recalled from Java then, sacked really. And on the way back, his ship called in at St Helena, and he engineered a meeting with Napoleon, who was in detention on the island. But sadly, it was rather a meaningless encounter. Raffles didn't impress Napoleon, and Napoleon did not impress Raffles at all. And back in London on leave, Raffles had to defend himself to the directors of the company against various charges against his administration. He was actually in semi-disgrace. But at the same time, far away from the disapproval of India House, he was being lionised by those he called the great men of the town. He means the scientists and members of the Royal Society. He had shipped home with him a vast amount of antiquarian objects and natural objects, which were of great interest to scholars and learned societies. because this was the great age of slightly random collecting. And he published a history of Java. He was made a Fellow of the Royal Society, and he became the friend of the scientists and aristocrats, and had lots of talks about plans for making a London Zoo. He was knighted by the Prince Regent because he made a friend of Princess Charlotte, his daughter, and he made a friend of hers by sending her a wedding present of tables and chairs made from the wonderful teak timber he brought back from Java. So, Tom Raffles from Walworth is now transformed into Sir Stamford Raffles. He has his portrait painted, very much the colonial governor. You'd never know he was sacked, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery. And he was half forgiven by the company, who couldn't fail to see that some people thought he was an ornament, not a liability. And he went back to the East Indies as Lieutenant Governor of Bencoolen, a remote settlement on the west coast of Sumatra. And there his greatest popular feat, really, in an expedition over the mountains in the jungly interior on foot. He had with him a botanist called Dr. Arnold, and they discovered a flower that had never yet been seen in all the world, a parasitical fleshy monster, great big thing this big, which was classified as Rafflesia arnoldi. Actually, it's hideous and it smells like bad meat, but nevertheless it's an extraordinary thing. It's a parasite. And when my husband Kevin and I were in Asia on the Raffles Trail, as it were, our guides into Sumatra showed us a bud, which was as big as a baby's head. But it was the wrong season to see a flower, and I was rather shocked to find that Kew doesn't actually have a live specimen at the moment. Raffles had a vision of empire much more ambitious than just coastal trading stations and treaties made with local chiefs. Britain lived or died by sea. Think Patrick O'Brien, funnily enough, in three of, I don't know if any of you are O'Brien readers, in three of Patrick O'Brien's novels, as a fictionalised Raffles appears as himself. But in the company, trade, not territory, was the maxim. The early empire was based on trade and profiteering. It didn't want territorial expansion because that just meant more money, it meant more staff, it meant garrisoning it, feeding it. And economical and political priorities with Britain at war made Raffles's passionate sort of aspirations, which he wrote in long dispatches to the company, for an Eastern Empire in the region, unrealistic, uninteresting for foreign policy makers back home. He would have been, and we can talk about this, more at home in the later empire, though then, of course, he would have been a different kind of person. Raffles' golden opportunity came after the end of the French wars, when nearly all the British trading settlements in the Eastern Archipelago were given back to the Dutch. The most profitable route was that between Bengal and China, and Britain just had to have something in between those for ships to hole up in, for trading, for watering, or should be absolutely excluded from this. And typically, it was when Raffles was in Calcutta facing up to reprimands for some more unorthodox and unauthorised things he'd been doing without any authority, that he managed to ally himself with the new Governor-General, Lord Hastings, in the hunt for this perfect new settlement, to be somewhere near the tip of Malaysia. So there was this young man with no advantages other than his talent and his zeal and his unquenchable energy, changing history by establishing on the wretchedly unpromising but geographically brilliant island of Singapore. This settlement became a world city. He stayed only a few days that first time. It's extraordinary how little time he spent there after raising the flag. He was anxious to get back to his wife in Penang, who was expecting a baby. And he left Major William Farquhar in charge, a Scotsman of course, with a whole raft of instructions and directives. Singapore, in his vision, Raffles' vision, was to be a free port. No slavery, no cockfighting, no gambling. The traders' warehouses to be here, the Chinese village here, the European town there. He laid it all out. And the Governor-General of India only told the company in London what Raffles was doing when it was too late. It had been done. The company vetoed the project. But by the time their dispatch arrived, there were probably about 5,000 new people living in Singapore. And the Dutch were as furious as the British, because then the news of this free port, the new free port on the crucial route between India and China, spread fast, and the settlement expanded with rapidity, taking advantage of all passing trade, local trade and international trade. Within a year, there were 5,000 inhabitants, and the bay was filled with ships of all nations, and the population growing exponentially. It was such a success that actually opposition seemed ludicrous. It was a lot of Chinese people came. Wherever trade is, the Chinese are. I mean, that was throughout the 19th century, I would think. And Singapore actually now is pretty much a Chinese city, and Raffles foresaw that. But William Farquhar, whom Raffles left in charge, and had been at his side when the flag was planted, and had done most of the preparatory negotiating with the local rulers, was also quite proprietary about Singapore, and Raffles left him as resident and commandant in charge. Let's quickly about Raffles' private life. He loved his family, and 3 of his sisters came out to him in the East. 2 of them found husbands out there, you know, the fishing fleet thing. He was married twice himself. His heart ruled his head. There was nothing socially advantageous about either of his marriages. Olivia, whom he married at 23 before he went east for the very first time, was 10 years older than himself, born out of wedlock, and already having a child of her own, also born out of wedlock. Olivia was flamboyant and emotional, and very much sniffed at by the prim and proper Scots wives of the Scots administrators because of her past, and Raffles loved her for her infinite variety, and she died in Java. Everyone died all the time out east, from malaria, dysentery, typhoid, and fast. You could dine with a friend one day and bury him the next afternoon. I think anybody who thinks that it was glamorous and exciting in those early fetid settlements needs to rethink. I mean, it was a really dreadful life. His second wife, Sophia, who he met in England when he was back on leave and got knighted, was, in quotes, the perfect wife. She wasn't young and she wasn't beautiful. She was devoted to him, and she was very brave. She came with him on those dangerous expeditions into the jungle of Sumatra when they found extraordinary plants and met strange tribes. She insisted on coming even when she was pregnant because she loved him so much. But I sometimes wonder whether Raffles might have thought it would be quite nice if she stayed at home sometimes. After setting up Singapore, Raffles was still Lieutenant Governor of Bencoolen in Sumatra, and he had a job to do there. And he concentrated on making that malaria-ridden settlement a model colony as much as he could, a model outpost, thus costing the company a whole lot more money with his investments. And he built a house for his growing family and for his uncaged menagerie of wild animals. For Sophia could do for him what Olivia had not been able to do. She gave him children, and he adored them. And usually English children were sent home to family in England by the time they were walking and talking, because otherwise, running around, they picked up fatal infections, or if they lived, they were spoilt rotten by their attendants. And Raffles and Sophia couldn't bear to part with theirs. Raffles was very like a modern father. His children were always around him, along with the half-wild birds and animals. And then in one dreadful year in Sumatra, they lost 4 of the adored children, one by one, all of them under 6. And the letters in which he writes to his sister about this are excruciating. One little baby girl called Ella survived, and she was sent back to Sophia's parents with Nurse Grimes. And neither Raffles nor Sophia ever got over the deaths of their children. And Raffles was often ill anyway with malarial fevers and what they call liver trouble, whatever. And now they were both dangerously run down and exhausted and shattered in health and spirits, and Raffles decided to retire. First he went back to Singapore, which he now called a child of my own, or almost my only child. He was thrilled by the way it had developed, but enraged by Farquhar's disregard of some of his detailed instructions and intentions. You can't blame Farquhar. He had to make decisions based on what was going on today. He was there on the ground, actual and changing circumstances, as Raffles himself had always done all his life. But Raffles was also beset now by blinding constant headache, not the sort of headache that you and I would say, I've got a headache, but they said they made him mad, they made him crazed, and they would last 2 days. But Farquhar, you see, had allowed slavery, gone against Raffles' town planning regulations, allowed building on the Padang, which had been designated by Raffles as open public space, as it still is, given appointments to his relations, as I have to say Raffles did too, allowed cockfighting, opium farming, and Raffles insisted on reversing every single one of Farquhar's arrangements and regulations, even insisting that whole villages should be moved, that if they'd been built in the wrong place. He was so angry and he was so adamant because Singapore was his one and last chance to create a world according to his own ideals and visions. But he did everything possible to make Farquhar's life impossible and was rewarded in kind. And their quarrel, which I read over, sort of horrible correspondence. You can imagine people rushing up the hill from Farquhar's house on the Padang to the residency up on Canning Hill, but 2 or 3 times a day with these vicious messages to each other. And it was disgraceful and it was unnecessary. And finally, Raffles just dismissed Farquhar. And before he left, and in spite of his headaches, he set out new rules for the administration. He built the government bungalow with the view of the bay up on the Singapore Hill. Those of you that know Singapore, it is now called Fort Canning. And there's some lovely engravings of his view down to the bay with the ships coming in. But now, standing on that hill, you don't even see the bay. You wouldn't know there was any water there because of the terrific clusters of high-rise buildings all along the waterline, which is a bit sad, I think. He drew up a new town plan and he laid down the constitution and an ambitious syllabus for a school which was to include modern science and ancient Malay literature both, called the Singapore Institution. Teaching was to be in the native languages as well as in English. But again, typical Raffles, it was largely aspirational. Some of the professors he appointed were in another part of the archipelago altogether. Some of them would shortly be dead or gone elsewhere. But he laid the foundation stone, and it wasn't actually built until he left. But it survived. It's now called the Raffles Institution, and it's a first-class secondary school whose alumni are making successes all over the world. And it's not only the Raffles Hotel and the Raffles Institution in Singapore. Medical centres, financial service companies, shopping malls, training centres, sports clubs, streets, you name it, are called either the Raffles or the Stamford or whatever. And Raffles, long after the end of empire, is the Singapore brand, as it were. I just want to go back for 1 minute. Sophia had a 5th baby called Flora, but she died too. And in February 1842, the sad pair sailed from Bencoolen for England for the last time on a ship called the Fame. They were going home for good. And they were also in charge of 2 small boys, one of them Raffles' nephew, both around 4. And they had loaded onto the Fame scores of heavy teak chests with all their worldly possessions. They were too happy to be going home, Raffles said afterwards, because on the first night out, when Sophia was already in bed, the Fame went on fire. It spread rapidly, and there were flames coming in at their cabin window. They snatched the 2 little boys out of their cots and somehow got into a boat, Sophia in her nightie with just a wrapper, nothing on her feet, and the Fame was carrying a cargo of gunpowder. And as the boat pulled away from the burning vessel, blazing all over, the gunpowder in the hold just blew up, and flames of all colours and outnoise all noise went through the night, and then it all went down, and the ship went down. It was all dark, and the little boat was alone in the sea. And the men rowing in what they hoped was the right direction back to Bencoolen. And Raffles used his shirt to cover the little boys. There was one little burst of rain. But actually, when morning came, it was much, much worse, because the sun blazed down, and they had no shelter, and there was no food and nothing to drink. Sophia said afterwards, if they'd been 1 night further out before the fire, they would be dead. But they were near enough the coast for it all to have been seen through telescopes, thank you, from Bencoolen, and somebody came out to rescue them. but all their clothes and possessions, Sophia's jewellery, her harp, and all Raffles' latest priceless collections of plants and fishes and animals and birds, and his books, and his Malay manuscripts, his maps, his precious objects, his records and professional papers, all lost at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. The end of his story, for there is more, I won't go into here, but just say that his end in England was sad, and that he never knew that his statue would be erected in Singapore, where it stands so proudly, and in Westminster Abbey, and that his portraits would hang in the National Portrait Gallery and the Council Room of the Royal Zoological Society. At the very end was this: Raffles learned on reaching England that the Dutch had formally recognised the British settlement in Singapore, and that the company had accepted it as a fait accompli. So Raffles now assumed he would receive a company pension. He sent in his long report, and this became even more urgent because there was a spectacular bank failure in this country in 1825 when he lost most of his money that he had. And he and Sophia, with an adopted nephew and a little surviving daughter, and Nurse Grimes, bought a country house called Highwood at Mill Hill. Mill Hill, then a village, sort of very salubrious, about 10 miles north of London. And his estate adjoined the estate of his great friend, the abolitionist William Wilberforce. He also had a town house in Upper Grosvenor Street. He thought he was going to get some money. And he fulfilled his ambition to found a zoo in London, co-founded with Humphrey Davy and others, conceived as a scientific institution for the collection and classification of world wildlife. And he was elected first president of the Zoological Society and presided over its first meeting. And he walked over and approved a tract of the Regent's Park for the site of the zoo. But at the second meeting, the Society had regretfully to record his death. The East India Company had come to a decision about Sir Stamford Raffles in a long, tortured report which balanced acknowledgement of his services and achievements with horrible criticism of his methods and policies. So far from granting him a pension, the directors invoiced him for £22,000 272, more than 60 times that in value in today's money, for expenses incurred by his unauthorised undertakings in the Eastern Isles, including the precipitous and unauthorised emancipation of the company's slaves. He was, in fact, a ruined man. And early in the morning, on the day before his 46th birthday, Sophia found him dead at the foot of the stairs at High Wood. And I always wondered whether he got up early, 4 o'clock in the morning, because his headache was so bad that he just couldn't stay in bed, or there was something he wanted to look up or write down. But there he was on the staircase. The reason for the headaches, which had been crippling him, and which rendered him really unhinged in his treatment of Farquhar, have recently been diagnosed by a Chinese doctor by recent scrutiny of all his symptoms and of the post-mortem, which we have. His death would have been hard to treat even today. His dream that Singapore would become a world hub and his own mightiest monument did come true, though. What I think about Raffles was he was a lovable, eccentric, vital, brilliant, and supremely inconvenient kind of man.
Well, perhaps that's what our men, as we call them, my Raffles, my Gordon, have in common: inconvenient men. I'm going to start by reading you a section of Henry Newbolt's Vita Lambada, which goes: "There's a breathless hush in the close tonight, 10 to make and the match to win, a bumping pitch and a blinding light, an hour to play and the last man in. And it's not for the sake of a ribboned coat or the selfish hope of a season's fame, but his captain's band on his shoulders smote, play up, and play the game." Sounds good, eh? But it isn't. It's actually a poem about the expedition that was sent into the Sudan, led by General Wolsey, to rescue my man, General Charles Gordon. And I, of course, am at a different position in talking about my man, because my man, in many ways, is a construct that I have created because I have written, I'm not a biographer, I'm a novelist. And what I've written is a book that centers on the expedition and the doomed expedition of another inconvenient and very difficult man, General Charles Gordon. And the thing about writing a novel is that if you write a novel set in history and about a real person, you obviously have to know an enormous amount about that person. You obviously have to inhabit them, but you don't inhabit them as a biographer does. You inhabit them through your imagination. So I know an awful lot about certain aspects of Gordon, but not everything about his life, except that the man that you inhabit is a product of his background, his past, his relationships, as well as what he did. And therefore, that has to be taken into the drawing of this character that was Charles Gordon. So just to give you a little bit about him, like Raffles, he didn't come from a ruling class family. My period is much later. It is the period of the Sudan expedition was Khartoum. It was in the 1884. And Gordon came from a big family, an army family. He was not ruling class. He did not have the money to buy a commission. The military at that point was not professionalised. It was the beginning of the professionalisation of the British Army. But he had to start at the bottom. He was an engineer, and he was an engineer during the Crimean War, which was the biggest disaster for the British Army of that century. And the thing that made the military understand that they had to start professionalising, because officers bought their commission and were not necessarily good at what they were doing. But Gordon was good at what he was doing. Gordon was an engineer. And, you know, he was the person that was brought in to work out how to breach a battlefield or how to shore up a battlefield. And he had a career in the British Army that wasn't particularly illustrious. And then he went to China. The Chinese emperor was facing a rebellion amongst his people, where a Christian sect had arisen. It was a strange kind of Christian sect. It was a Christianity that was taken from the Bible and from what missionaries had told people, but it actually had its own way of doing things. So it didn't believe in the Trinity. It had four. It had the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and the younger brother. And the leader of this sect was the younger brother. And basically what the younger brother was doing was leading a rebellion against an emperor who was suppressing people. And what Gordon was sent to do was to defend the rights of British merchants, to make sure that the younger brother didn't overrun British economic interests. And he fought what was eventually a victorious campaign. He managed to wipe out the younger brother, or so it was said in England. In fact, if you look at the record, it wasn't really Gordon who did it. It was a Chinese general who eventually got control of the Chinese troops. But Gordon was basically leading a group of mercenaries, Chinese mercenaries who were fighting because they were being paid, and he found it very difficult to do it. And also, Gordon was an incredibly devout man. This is the 70s, 1880s in Britain, where there were many different Christian sects, some of them very strange, and Gordon was stranger than all of them. Many Christians thought, yes, he's very devout, but isn't he a bit odd? He believed literally in the Bible. He believed that you could locate heaven, that you could locate everything that was written, that it has happened absolutely as it was said. And he wasn't a very sociable man. I was very moved by the tale of Raffles and the loss of his children. And I was actually very frightened that those two boys were going to die in the fire as well. They had to go. But Gordon never had children. And as far as we know, Gordon never had a relationship. Didn't particularly like women. And I guess with a modern mindset, you would say that possibly he was gay. But of course, at that time, it wasn't possible for him to express it. And, some people say that he was actually sexually abused when he was a kid and he became totally asexual. He was not a sociable man. He didn't like company. He didn't like being in the world of the British ruling classes. He didn't feel he fit in. And he was the one person in the world who was invited to supper by the Prince of Wales after he had been to China, because he came back a hero to the English, and he was known as Chinese Gordon, and he wore the yellow robes given to him by the Chinese emperor, and the Prince of Wales thought it was rather exotic and invited Gordon to supper, and Gordon sent a note back saying, "I'm terribly sorry, I can't come because I go to bed too early." Nobody else. This was not an easy man. He went then to the Sudan. He became Governor General of the Sudan. He was actually seconded because the Sudan was then run by the Egyptians, and he was seconded to the Egyptians in order to run it. And his aim was supposedly to end slavery. And it's just so interesting how over these centuries the whole issue of slavery still continues throughout the world. And Gordon came back after having been Governor General of the Sudan, considered to be, the person who had done more than anybody to end slavery in the Sudan. And the only person who knew that he hadn't was Gordon. And he was a very honest man. And what he had realized while he had been there was that slavery was about the only form of buying and selling slaves was the only form of making money in the Sudan. It's a desolate place. There wasn't any agriculture except for around the Nile. There's no minerals. There was nothing, and there was only slavery. So all Gordon could do was to stop the slave ships from taking slaves up the Nile in order to get them into Egypt and throughout the world. And he knew that he managed successfully to do that, but what happened is the slave traders just took the slaves across the desert and thus gave the slaves a much worse life, because to go up the Nile in a hold in a boat is awful but bearable and survivable. To be crossed across the desert is often not survivable. And Gordon was too honest not to know that he hadn't actually done what the English thought of him. And the thing about Gordon is that his fervent religious beliefs were very much part of the man that he was. But because of his literal interpretation of the Bible and of what God's word is, he completely believed in the fact that God knew everything and that everything that happened was God's will. That's a difficult thing for a military man to stick by, because what's the point of going to battle? What's the point of struggling in life? What's the point of trying to end slavery if it's already dictated by God? And this runs through the considerable numbers of diaries that Gordon left. This tortured thing about what does free will mean? When I started researching Gordon, even though I didn't have to know everything because I was writing a novel, and my novel features not just Gordon but many other characters, some of them real and some of them made up, I read Gordon's diaries over and over again. And when I started, I really disliked the man. I thought he was prim. I thought he was boring. I thought he ignored what was happening in the world around him. And by the time I ended writing the book, I consider him to be my Gordon. I felt very fond of him. And that's partly what has to happen. If you have a character in a novel, even if they're based on history and even if they're difficult, you have to inhabit them from the inside. And you have to learn to find something in them and something in their humanity which will make you write them from the inside and without judgment. And for me, I sort of began to like the tetchy madman that he was. But madman he was, and that has a lot to do with how Gordon ended up. Basically what happened was that the British had become increasingly involved in Egypt because of the Suez Canal. That the Egyptian government had decided on a mad modernization scheme that they wanted to be as good as England. And therefore, they started pouring a huge amount of money into all sorts of parts of the infrastructure of Egypt, including the Suez Canal. And they borrowed the money from British and French and German merchants, and then they couldn't pay it back. And that is how the English ended up having control of the Suez Canal, which was important for trade, but more than that, was important in English eyes for India. And this is 1884. It's actually, you can see in hindsight, it's the beginning of the end of the empire. But India was the jewel in Victoria's crown, and anything for India. The Egyptians were in Sudan. They were completely brutal in the way that they ruled the country. They just went in there to collect taxes. And that was the reason for the survival of slavery, actually, is because the exchange of slaves was the only way to make money, and because the Egyptian troops continually raised the amount of taxes people had to have, there was an increase in the slave trade. And most of the Egyptian troops who were in Sudan were not there by choice. They absolutely hated being there, and they could never leave until they died. It was the most terrible posting to get, and you usually got it because you had done something wrong in the Egyptian army. So the Egyptian army is ruling Sudan, disliked, but, ruling a country that is very disparate in its population groups, very divided into different tribes. And there rises up in the Sudan a man who calls himself the Mahdi. And the Mahdi has been foretold in the Quran to be a descendant of the Prophet who is going to return at a certain year in the Islamic calendar, which was 1882 in the English calendar, and is going to cleanse Islam. He's going to rise up and cleanse the country and then cleanse the whole of Islam. This is what originally took me to writing about Gordon. There were echoes of what's happened in the modern world back there in 1883 and 1882 in the Sudan. And the Mahdi gathered around him increasing numbers of different Sudanese. These tribes who previously had fought each other joined with him in the jihad to drive out the Egyptian invader. In fact, I think one could see the Mahdi was a very clever politician. And what he was doing was he was using religion. He was actually waging a war of national liberation. He wanted to get rid of the Egyptians. And he used religion to galvanize all these previous quarreling tribes together in a war against the Egyptians. And he was gradually moving up and coming close to Khartoum. At which point, into this history came another extremely difficult man, a man called William Stead. And William Stead could be seen to be the father of modern tabloid journalism. And one of the reasons that he was is that William Stead had a minister as a father who required, for reasons that I've never quite understood, that all his children are able to go and talk to people and come back and report verbatim what they had said. And the result of this is William Stead said that he could interview anybody for as long as he wanted, and he could remember exactly what they said. And so he started pioneering a form of journalism before tape recorders ever came in, where instead of just doing a small news report, there would actually be an article and quoting what the person had said. And William Stead, when the Mahdi was moving up, felt very strongly that the English had some kind of sense of responsibility for the Egyptian troops who were going to be swamped by the Mahdi and these, the jihad that was going to convert them all to Islam or kill them, went and doorstepped Gordon, who was on a break. And Gordon was always on a break because he really couldn't stand being in the army because he was far too undisciplined, even in those days, and went to ask Gordon what they should do. And Gordon, who could one day say, do nothing, the next day could say, this is the most terrible thing and we've got to do something. And William Stead wrote an article saying, General Gordon says we have to do something. We have responsibility for the sake of the empire. We have to get out there. And he wrote this, and all the other newspapers picked it up, and there was a huge furore. And eventually Gladstone, who was the prime minister at that time of a warring cabinet, was persuaded to be allowed to send Gordon to Khartoum to, it's unclear what. And that is one of the things that, history has still disputed, is some members of the cabinet, and Gordon said that he was sent to fight the Mahdi, and some members of the cabinet, and Gladstone said he was sent to investigate. Anyway, off he went. He went immediately, they had decided. He took the train. He had no money. You had to take your own money. All members of the cabinet who had supported him came and gave them what they had in their pockets. One of them went and sold his watch in some club and gave the money to Gordon. And off Gordon went to Khartoum. And I don't have time to detail it all, but down he went to Khartoum and got himself besieged. And in hindsight, it is completely clear that Gordon, going with one other person to Khartoum, was not going to be able to stop a jihad from... So there he was besieged. Now, he didn't have any support in the beginning because the anti-slavery lobby turned against him, because Gordon, in one of the moments where he was actually thinking rationally, the first thing he did when he went into Khartoum was allow people to keep their slaves, because if he thought he didn't, then all the merchants would defect and they would have no defense in Khartoum. But as soon as he did that, the people who defended him in Britain and who, were concerned for him basically turned their backs on him because he had betrayed the anti-slavery movement. So there he was. And Gordon, my Gordon, bit difficult, quite impossible, bit irrational, actually very irrational, kept sending telegrams out. Because in those days, you could be both besieged in Khartoum and be able to send messages out to get to England, and telegrams out, which, so obviously if Gordon had wanted to leave Khartoum, he could have done, but he was too honourable to do that. He didn't want to leave the Egyptian troops. So one day the telegram would say, everything's fine, I'm in total control. And the next day the telegram would say, if you don't come yesterday, I'll be dead tomorrow. And therefore, whoever was on the receiving end of Gordon's telegrams could decide what they were going to do. Eventually what was happened, and again against Gladstone's wishes, the cabinet threatened to rebel if an rescue expedition wasn't sent to rescue Gordon. And so the biggest British expedition ever went to the Sudan, the wrong way it has to be said, led by General Wolseley to rescue General Gordon, and arrived 2 days too late. Gordon had his head cut off. Or it's not entirely clear how he died. I mean, it's interesting looking at the art that comes up after Gordon died, because depending on what the British Empire has thought about is the representation of Gordon. So some of the time he has his back to the picture and he's being attacked from the back, innocent victim. And at another time he's firing warrior. And it's, these portrayals, nobody knows exactly how he died. But the poem that I read you was part of a poem about the rescue expedition that went to get Gordon, Wolsey's expedition. And part of the problem with the military was still that there was a lack of professionalization. So there are many stories of officers who were in charge of buying the camels for this expedition, and they did in fact buy camels, but they used quite a few of them to carry their champagne into war. And so when the expedition tried to cross, there weren't enough camels. But also, this was a real learning curve for the British Army, because they crossed the deserts eventually. I mean, first of all, Wolseley had had a great success in Canada in the Red River expedition, so he decided he would go down the Nile in the same way he had gone across the Red River, despite the fact that many people told him, but hold on a minute, they're different rivers. And the Nile has enormous numbers of cataracts, which are difficult to cross, and in the hottest season, which is when they eventually went, because Gladstone wouldn't want them to go before, the Nile is low, the cataracts become even more difficult to cross. So there are actually pictures of journalists who went with them, who drew pictures of, them, people hauling boats across from the bank across these cataracts in order to get them to the next bit of the Nile. But the other thing that happened is that the British military had completely misjudged the courage of the people who they were fighting against. And up till then, nobody had ever breached a British square. The English were known for their square, and that anybody who came towards the square would be cut down. And that indeed happened in the middle of the desert, when all these, when the British were getting closer to Khartoum, people started to attack them. They formed a square. The people who were attacking him, the Mahdi's troops, were indeed cut down, and they kept on coming. And they kept on coming over the bodies of their comrades until eventually they got so close, they actually breached the British square that nobody had ever done before. And there are very moving accounts by soldiers who were there of their tremendous respect for this kind of courage by people that, Kipling was later to call the fuzzy wuzzies, because they had dreadlocks basically. And so, but in Kipling's poem, he also talks about the incredible courage. So I'm going to end on Henry Newbolt, who's ends with, "The sand of the desert is sodden red." Sorry, I've got it in different pages. "Red with the wreck of the square that broke, the Gatlings jammed, and the colonels dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke." And the poem ends, "The river of death has brimmed his banks, and England's far, and honours a name, but the voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game." Gordon played and he lost.
Well. They say the very best writing takes you on a journey, and I feel we've certainly been on a journey today. Victoria, Gillian, thank you so much. We have got time for some questions, so I hope you've all been having a think about what you'd like to ask about Raffles and Gordon, and I think we've got some floating microphones around, so if you could just stand up when you get the microphone, that would be incredibly helpful for us to spot you. Gentleman over there.
I'd like to ask Jillian if she blames Gladstone for what had happened at all, because Sir Winston Churchill, in his biography, or his history of the English-speaking peoples, certainly does blame Gladstone, and I just wonder whether Gladstone was to blame.
My reading of it, and of course Winston Churchill went in the revenge expedition that happened 10 years later, which basically is why Sudan ended up British, because although the Mahdi won then, 10 years later he was dead, and the British just decimated the Mahdi's troops and took over. My reading of it is, no, if anything it might be to blame, it was the fact that Gladstone had gout and wasn't in the cabinet meeting, and he was seriously ill when the decision was taken to send Gordon. But I think it was also a product of the fact that there was no cabinet responsibility in those times. There were different factions, and that Gladstone was pushed into doing something that he didn't want to do. And presumably Churchill blames him for the fact that Gladstone dragged his feet about sending a rescue expedition, and so that when it came it was too late. But the reason, I mean, that becomes a question of what you think is important, because Gladstone dragged his feet because he thought Gordon was a madman. Why is he going there on his own? It's his own. He knew what he was getting into. You cannot send a whole army to rescue one man, which is effectively what it was, and therefore risk the death of so many others. And in fact, there was the death of so many others. They weren't necessary. Quite a few of the British army died, but in fact, very many Sudanese died in that. So I tend to think that Gladstone was probably right, but I could see why Winston Churchill blamed him.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm really interested and quite love the way you call them your men. How did you find them? What kind of interested you in? How did you pick them? What was that process?
I think there are two things going on here. One is about the people like old lefties like us can now write about empire, in that until let's say the first third of the 20th century was over, the British Empire was just heroes of empire, and then with revisionism, you couldn't actually write about anybody who had anything to do with the empire without saying they were a crook, a villain, and a sadist. And of course, now I sometimes think that the people who are students now in, say, Indonesia or India, it's their grandfathers who made the break. It's history to them, as it's long time ago now, and they are looking at it quite differently. I think the days of knee-jerk hostility in either direction are kind of over. So it's much more interesting, because you can go in and look at these people as individuals, or what they were really like in the times that they were, and they were made into constructs, both Gordon and Raffles, to serve the myths of empire, with names like Heroes of Empire and anthologies of little mini lives of people. But in my case, it was entirely personal how I came from Raffles. I had written mostly about writers before that, and I suddenly didn't want any more to write about somebody whose most exciting moments are spent sitting at a desk. I just wanted the real world. And my husband Kevin, who had a great deal of professional work in Southeast Asia, came back with a monumental book. He had a special bag he had to bring it back on, which was a facsimile of the memoir that Safar, the one who had all the children, wrote of her husband, published a few years after his death, and it was completely hagiographical. It was sort of remaking his reputation. And I read it, and I thought, this is the story, but it's not the whole story. And I started reading around. I found she'd missed out every single reference to Olivia. It was as if the first wife had never occurred, and except one inaccurate footnote. And so I gradually got hooked and started reading my way through the 5 linear miles of East India Company papers in the British Library.
And mine was a slightly different process, but I always find it very hard to know what I'm going to write next. And, I am of the school that I once came out of somebody asking me, where do you get your ideas from? And I read some poet who'd said, if I knew where I got my ideas from, I'd go there more often. And I have trouble going there more often. And so what I do is, when I'm about to start another book, or I'm thinking about what I'm going to write, is I just read at random to see what sparks my mind and my imagination. And I was just flicking through a book on annals of empire, which were this particular period of history. And there were some articles on Gordon, and Gordon rung a bell for me for 2 reasons. One probably is to do with such a mad expedition to Africa. I mean, there were, wars started in the name of empire that made some economic sense, but Gordon's did not make any sense. And so, but also because it was in Africa, because I'm interested in writing in that continent. And the other reason was that this was post the Iraq War. It was Tony Blair, a good man who believes himself to be good, starting a war that I absolutely believed then and still believe was wrong and bad. And Gordon going for a good reason to fight a jihad for a reason that he thought was good, which what I believe is bad. And so that sort of, I thought there's something in here for me, I should explore this more. And then what I go and do is I go and read a lot. And sometimes that will put me in a dead end. I'll think I can't be there imaginatively. And in this case, as I said, I started off thinking I cannot write about this man because I dislike him so intensely. And then I began to sort of see the seduction of who he was and the complexity of who he was, and that's what took me there.
Fabulous. Any other questions? Just over there. I think a mic's on its way to you. There we are. Oh.
I
One
think,
and then the next.
is it worth drawing out the difference in public attitudes between the 1830s and the 1880s? I mean, Gladstone, in a sense, is hoist with his own petard. He popularised politics and with his Midlothian campaign. But in a sense, he really felt driven to do this mad expedition as a result of public interest and public popular imperialism. Whereas in the 1820s and 1830s, the attitude was very different. The East India Company was, after all, under pretty continuous investigation by Parliament. Its status was questioned, which meant, ironically, you could have, as it were, individuals doing their own thing without this sort of public interest and involvement in what they were doing, which by the 1880s seems to be impossible.
There was quite a lot of public interest in what Raffles was doing, in that you're quite right, sir, in saying that public opinion and Parliament were taking more and more interest in the failing East India Company. There were more and more questions in the House. With every renewal of its charter, which happened about every, can't remember, 20 years, more of its powers were taken away. And it was sort of understood to be a toothless monster, really, by the time. But these sort of inadequacies and things like there not being proper cabinet decisions or anything like that means that people like Gordon and Raffles, the mavericks, actually have a completely free hand, really, because they're uncontrollable. Whereas now there would be so much box ticking, they'd never be allowed to do any of these things. But
perhaps in Gordon's case, that's a good thing.
Well, I mean,
Perhaps,
yes. But I think that the Empire didn't know what it was doing when the Empire was the East India Company, because it was just about trying to make money, which it was failing to do. And faute de mieux, they were having to make settlements. But I think my man would have been much happier if he'd lived in the days of your man, because he actually did believe in colonisation. He thought that was the way forward. But that was too far ahead in the 1820s.
And I think it's an interesting point, and we could go into it in great details. But one of the things that happened to do with Gladstone is that this man, William Stead, the journalist, was one of the people who helped Gladstone, who used popular newspapers and appealing to the people. He's a very interesting man, William Stead, to help Gladstone in his Midlothian campaign to get this. And in the end, it was this same thing, this Gordon, that saw Gladstone's downfall. Because when when the country heard that Gordon had been killed in this terrible way, and that our, Chinese Gordon, the man who abolished slavery in Sudan, was not rescued because Gladstone went too late. Gladstone lost his cabinet and he lost his election, and that was the end of Gladstone. So the same thing that had brought him to power was what brought him down. But that's because, the 1880s is the beginning of modernity. We are still living in a way in the era that started then.
I want to say one more thing about the religious thing. You said about how he really, really believed, your man really, really believed. And Raffles was like a sort of an enlightened man. His religion was purely nominal. He thought that the Christian ethic was a good way to run a society. The East India Company until 1813 didn't even allow missionaries to come out, and when they were allowed out, Raffles thought they were incredibly incompetent. He said if he'd been, they never converted anybody. You know, if he'd been converting, they'd all be converted by now. But he wasn't going to. And Raffles always wrote, in that era of capital letters for common nouns, you know, like a fine table, he would put a capital T for table. He always wrote God with a small g, with a lowercase g, which is absolutely, even now that's quite striking. And then it was extraordinary. And he would refer much more happily to providence than, he never referred to Christ or anything like that. So what is interesting is that the surge of religion, as the century goes on, you know, when it was really at a low ebb in his time.
Fabulous, thank you. I think we have a question there, gentleman there.
Hello, Victoria. I thoroughly enjoyed both your presentations. I have connections with both Singapore and also Africa. Yeah, I have a slightly different perspectives on the heroes of the empire. You mentioned in your researches on both. Did you gauge the reaction of either the Sudanese or Singaporeans about the heroes of the empire?
At what period? Like now? What
Right now.
Right
Because
now.
I think there are universities in both places, and the period of revision has ended. Did you find many scholars and interested in it?
There's a lot of scholars working on what they call the British period in Java, as it were. In Singapore, it's very interesting. I think a lot of people, they just know that Raffles is something very important to do with Singapore, and anything that is Raffles and Raffles in Singapore. But in Java, Raffles actually destroyed the Kraton of Yogyakarta. He had it sacked, and it was a very drastic thing to do. And when we were being shown round by a guide, who was a primary school teacher, therefore a reasonably educated person, trained as a guide, I said, how do people feel about Raffles' having sacked the Kraton here? She said, but that didn't... Mr. Raffles was a good man. He didn't do that. And I said, I'm afraid he did. And she said, you are wrong. Mr. Raffles would never do a thing like that. So, I mean, the mythology is now arising on the other side of the world.
And as far as Gordon is concerned, he's irrelevant to Sudan. He's a blip of history. In fact, what's more interesting in the Sudan is the attitude to the Mahdi and the various different contestations of what the Mahdi was. Was he really the descendant of the Prophet, as some people still say? And therefore, his party, which still exists in his name, is somehow special in Sudanese policies because it comes straight from the Quran to there. And those people who say, no, he was a political leader. Whereas Gordon, I think statues have been taken down. I think Gordon College has been renamed. He's a blip in history, but actually he's a blip in our history too. Read books on the empire, and you will be hard pressed to find this moment in there. It's not very much part of the development of the British Empire because it was such a strange thing, and it wouldn't have happened if not for that man, Gordon. And that's why it's such a great subject for fiction, because that's what fiction can do so well, is talk about something that isn't foregone conclusion, that isn't foretold, but it is to do with the fact that just some people are really weird and they do weird things sometimes.
They are really weird. But we were saying just before we came and sat up here that in fact the British Empire was rather quickly over. It was short. We talk about the British Empire, especially people as old as I am, as if it was some sort of huge and monolithic and forever thing. Actually, it was, compared with the empires of the world, it was another blip, And it's very interesting suddenly being able to see things in perspective that we weren't able to before.
Thank you. Yes, go on. Alan.
It's odd that you should be speaking here about Gordon when it was, after all, Lytton Strachey who used Gordon in eminent Victorians as the symbol of everything everybody here detested about the British Empire.
Absolutely, and he said all sorts of very irascible things about Gordon, I think some of which were probably not true, including the fact that Gordon was a hopeless alcoholic, which I think Gordon liked to drink, but they all like to drink. But I don't think it was entirely true. But it is. He used him as an example of everything that is wrong about the empire.
And I think we had one last question, just gentleman over there.
I'm very interested in this concept of the British Empire as an accident, and that wasn't really intentional. But I wanted to really follow on a previous question, which is you were talking about public opinion. And public opinion in terms of Parliament in 1820 is a very restricted constituency compared to what it is in 1880, following the Reform Acts and things. And even then it's only partial, even in the 1880s. But I just wondered how that factored into who things were playing to, and the issue around Gordon as somebody who has been talked about as a catalyst for what happened.
I think that was so interesting reading the 1880s, because in the 1880s they have what we now call flash mobs. You know, we think flash mobs where people suddenly go and demonstrate about something spontaneously, and they're suddenly, you know, they text each other and they go and demonstrate. Used to happen a lot in the 1880s, where people would get very angry about something and they would go out onto the street and they would demonstrate, with the newspapers often leading the charge. And that's why I say it is the beginning of modernity. It is, you know, it is a world that is very recognizable to us, even though it is 130 years ago.
Thank you. Victoria, Gillian, thank you for a thoroughly captivating session on your men. 2 inconvenient men, 2 difficult men, 2 clearly very isolated men, and in Gordon's case, maybe mad man. But ultimately, it seems, the take is honourable men. Thank you for taking us on that journey through Asia and Africa, and I hope you will all have found it as fascinating as I did, and join me in offering a warm vote of thanks to Victoria and Gillian.